Right, so yeah, there's the start recording. So I said this to gamers as well, but like basically I've just written down a bunch of bullet points that I'll probably go through over time and make notes as we're going through and think of things to say as we're talking. It'll mostly be just like a casual conversation because, obviously I haven't exactly researched what professionals do in this sort of regard. So to start with this, tell us a bit about yourself and the things that you've made over the years.
All right. I go by Watson in most communities. I joined the Fangame community in, I want to say, late 2013, and I think it was around like 2015 onwards that I really got into it and started making my own fan games. The journey which I went on as a game maker has definitely run a very long course of time. I've made all sorts of things over the years, and my first few games were definitely pretty simple, and over time, I played a bunch of games and I learned from them, and eventually the things I started to make got a little bit more ambitious, and I'd like to say that I've made a good handful of pretty good fan games at this point. And nowadays, I'm even starting to branching out a little bit further than that. But I still remember pretty clearly what my time in the fan game community has been like.
So you got into fan games at like 2013. So how did you find them in the first place, and what caught your attention with them?
So the precise starting point is hard for me to vividly recall. I know that my true first starting point was, I want to say, a little bit earlier than 2013. I think I checked out the KN forums once and downloaded like two particular fan games off of there. I think one of them was a fan game called I Want to Be the Persistent or something of that ilk, and another one was Sublime. And I didn't.
Oh, that's a roll.
Yeah, I didn't get very far in either of those two games. But after that, I decided, not really my thing. Fast forward a bit, I learned about Twitch. And when I started out on Twitch, I was particularly fond of the speedrunning circles. Things like Super Mario 64, and particularly Legend of Zelda Wind Waker.
The classics, yeah, definitely of that era.
And I think at some point, just hopping from channel to channel, I discovered 10 Shots. And 10 Shots back in the day was well known for speedrunning lots of fan games, such as Hero Again and 8-Bit, probably a lot of others as well.
Yeah, I remember Galaxy in the original.
I'd have to pull up my emails from 10 years ago to tell you the specifics, but he was basically my entry point.
Oh, so you emailed 10 Shots directly saying
No,
something?
No.
Oh.
I have Twitch notification emails dating back that long.
Oh wow, you kept those. That makes sense. Okay. Telling you when he went live?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Jeez, alright. And then you were watching 10 Shots do speedruns and then thought, I can make that as well or something? Or
so it was sort of a... even at that point, I wasn't necessarily into playing fan games or the community at large, but I remember the particular game that changed my mind about that was when 10 Shots was playing one of Stonk's games. I want to say it was part of the Weston Douglas Jones series. It wasn't the first one. It was one of the ones in the middle, I want to say. But I really enjoyed what I saw of that stream. And when Stonk appeared in 10 Shots chat to talk about it with it, that was basically when it clicked in me that the people who make these fan games are also part of a community. And that was when I decided that I was really interested in actually joining the fan game community at large. And so that's where I started like basically like discovering what fan games are all about, figuring out like which games are popular to play and what sort of makers were prolific. So I want to say that's where my fan game career basically truly started.
So when you started like searching this stuff, were you aiming to like try to copy the prolific makers or the popular games? Do you want to like make things similar to what they'd done already, or were you just using them to try to understand how things worked?
I didn't have too many particular goals in mind. I do know that I started out wanting to make fan games pretty early. And I did have some specific fan games which sort of inspired me, such as Camellia 2 and Nang. And I definitely tried to like emulate the things I saw in those games. But also, like, I was pretty young at that time, like not even an adult yet. And so I still had plenty of like innate creativity and ideas, which like the Game Maker project was basically a blank canvas to me.
Yeah.
So I tried making all sorts of things. As you can imagine, my very first project, I don't have the files for it anymore, but I do still remember what it was like. It was basically what you could imagine a fan game from that era to look like. Flat gray background. The first save was like a gate jump and a corner jump, followed by like a trap fight.
Of course.
And I do recall that I wanted to like add gimmicks and stuff, but I didn't know how to code. In fact, at the time, I didn't even know what the step event was supposed to be for, things like that. So I like set all my code in the create events of objects, and when they didn't work, I was like, why doesn't this work? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of early stories for that stuff. Yeah, we have a lot more detailed ways to learn nowadays compared to the early days of fan games, that's for sure.
Yeah. I do remember it was a slow process to learn all the ins and outs of like not only Game Maker, how it works, but also like the language. I remember one particular thing which I had to figure out was this isn't a thing in modern Game Maker, but for Game Maker 8 in particular, there was this setting called Advanced Mode.
Okay.
Which basically, it says it's Advanced Mode, but really what it is it just disables some features if it's off, such as the ability to edit tiles in a room.
What?
Yeah.
What sort of edits? Okay, yeah, I've never heard of Advanced Mode before. That's an interesting way of making things more complicated, I guess.
Yeah, I remember specifically because I would try to edit the rooms and I could remove the blocks, but the visuals for the blocks were still there, and I had to rack my brain for so long, like, why can't I move these? Why can't I change these? And to learn that not only were there like entire editor features, which were just being like basically marked as invisible, but I had to like find that setting myself and turn it on to finally like actually be able to properly use Game Maker. So that was fun.
Yeah, when most people say that they're having issues with the tile sets, it's because they don't know that they can control click or shift click, not that they literally cannot do anything.
Yeah, Game Maker 8 sure is a tool.
Yeah, it had some pros and it definitely had some cons, unfortunately. So, when you were first learning Game Maker, you said it was a slow process, so like, how did you normally try to go around trying to learn things then? Like, were you just like looking up the Game Maker guide and just going through pages to understand how everything works, or something else?
That wasn't a point I reached until quite a lot later. When I started out making fan games, I basically just, like, I learned by example. There were fan games which had stuff which I wanted to make, and I would try to recreate the things that I saw in those games. And that is how I would learn. And I would, like, look through all the engine assets, try to understand what the code meant that I was given.
Do you mean
And try
looking
to-
through the game's code specifically and then trying to copy that to your own, or like remaking it while looking at the original?
Uh,
I assume you
most-
mean you're like looking at their project file for the record, not just like watching somebody play the game.
At the very start, before I knew of things like the decompiler, I just had the engine assets to work with. So
Gotcha.
I analyzed the code of the engine assets to try and figure out how the language worked and how to like actually work with GameMaker and start doing more advanced things. And I got reasonably far in that. I did figure out a decent number of things on my own. I remember, I think the next major step was there was this really old avoidance tutorial.
God.
It was like a YouTube video. I forget the particular maker. I want to say it was someone Spanish, but that video was basically, it taught me about things like the instance create function and assigning variables to instances, things which I couldn't figure out easily just from analyzing the engine itself. It also taught me things about for loops. So it was basically like I was learning not only how to make fan games at the time, but also learning how to program in general.
Yeah, I gotcha.
And,
So you didn't try to learn like a language before GameMaker. GameMaker was where you started with.
Yeah, I technically did have a brief stint of making levels for Dust Force in the years prior to that.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, that was the primary community I hailed from before I learned about fan games.
Were you with them for a long time then? Because like I've got a decent amount of awareness of the Dust Force community, and they've got a lot of stuff going on with their community-made levels.
Yeah, I think somewhere around 2011 to 2012, I want to say, is where I was most active. Back then, the Dust Force community was like, the levels were basically like on the same level as like all the base levels, and I didn't really know how to use all the visual assets which that editor provided, and of course the Dust Force level editor, it doesn't have any coding involved. It's just objects and stuff and level design in its purest.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It wasn't the same as the Dust Force community today, which I believe has extensive modding capability.
Yeah, they've done showcases at various marathons of their stuff at this point, and it's definitely expanded out a fair bit. Unsurprisingly, as it has been 10 years.
But yeah, so after that avoidance tutorial, my memory is pretty hazy because a lot of things were happening around that point in time, like me just like finding more and more channels and more fan games to play, stuff like that. I want to say the next major milestone was learning about the decompiler, and this was even before like Adam's decompiler.
Yeah, the early days one.
But I used that to decompile projects like Nang and Camellia 2 and stuff like that. Actually, I forget if Camellia 2 had anti-decompiler. I might have not decompiled that particular one.
I don't think it had anything, but yeah.
But yeah, the idea was that I would open those projects in the decompiler, and whenever I saw an effect that I liked, such as in Nang, you know how the secrets look? They're just like golden triangles which bob up and down.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated by that like bobbing effect. Like, how did they wave up and down like that? And so I would go into the code for that object, and that's where I learned about the trigonometric functions. And
Interesting.
that's when I learned that like not only was programming involved in game making, but also math. And so it was also around that time that I gained an interest in math. Even beyond like what I knew in school at the time. Like I started to like really learn math as to an end for game making.
That's very interesting, because I was going to say, because like people have seen the stuff that you've made by today's day and age, obviously, so like I was going to ask if you were always interested in maths in the first place, because it seemed like something you probably would be if you're that good at it by now, but from the sounds of it, you didn't really care much about the subject beforehand, and then you did game making, and then suddenly maths was cool in a sense, right?
Yeah, I think that's an apt way to put it. It also helped that at the time, I believe I reached out to Plasma Napkin, who was basically, at that time, the most knowledgeable and experienced game maker user in the fangame community, I want to say. And also just like a solid grasp on math and programming in general.
Yeah.
And so I remember reaching out to him for coding advice and things like how do you do 3D in GameMaker? What are rotation matrices? So Plasma taught me a lot of things and enabled me to research even more things which apply to game making, which I carry with me today.
Interesting. Just as an aside, do you know like what sort of time period this was then?
I don't have a precise timetable, but I want to say around 2015, maybe early 2016.
Gotcha.
This was like there's a pretty clear dividing line, which I want to say is before Discord and after Discord, because back in the day, the fangame community, when it wasn't on Twitch, it was basically lots of different Skype factions.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely was aware of that. You'd have to find, like, the Skype groups to try to properly converse with people, or you're probably just being on the Kane forums, I guess?
I actually didn't have much interest in the KN forums after I, like, discovered the I Wanna community forums, as well as the particular Skype groups that I was in. I remember I wasn't in a lot of Skype groups at the time. I think the three main groups that I was in were TJ's Skype group, and Blue Mage's Skype group, and then a sort of universal Skype group that was called Needle Talk. And that was basically like the server for Needle players back in the day from all over the globe. I remember lots of Needle big names started out in that community, especially like JGB and Kanata, lots of people.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know a huge amount about the Skype group stuff, so I wasn't really around that era. So what sort of, like, what was the general atmosphere of the groups you were in then, and what sort of stuff got talked about? Because you said there was TJ, Blue Mage, and the Needle Talk. The Needle Talk group's pretty clear, as you just said, but, like, TJ and Blue Mage group, I know nothing about.
It was basically just, like... It was basically just a place to talk. Needle Talk was a little bit different, because in that group, it was like primarily centered around the discussion of playing needle games. But obviously, as I was learning GameMaker at the time, I would also make a habit of like posting about the fan games I was making in that server. In Blue Mages and TJ's group, it was more just like talking, not necessarily as much sharing, but all three of them had to do with fan games in some capacity. I don't remember the precise sorts of conversations we would have back then, but...
Well, was there nothing like, how do I do a gate jump type of thing? Or was there actually, like, hashtag serious type conversations, you know?
Well, in the case of Blue Mages and TJ's group, I would say they're pretty similar to the sorts of, like, Discord servers centered around like our particular like streamer community or like in circle, so that sort of group. Needle Talk was the exception because that was a group where you could ask questions about like how do I do this jump and like discussing needle tech and posting screenshots, including the classic like clear screenshots even before Discord. So two different sort of types of servers which serve different functions, but I still pretty, at least to an extent, I remember what those were like.
Yeah, no, that's very cool to hear. Yeah, that's a very different era of community, obviously. Discord's been around for so long, I don't think too many people remember the pre-Discord era so well at this point. Oh yeah, so go back a bit then to what we were talking about before. So you said that, like, you weren't really into, like, you hadn't really thought about the idea of making games before you came across I Want to Be the Guy Fangames. So, like, what exactly inspired you to start trying to make games in the first place?
That is actually a question which I'm not sure I can pinpoint the precise source of. I think the nebulous idea of wanting to make a game dates back even before that. Like, maybe even when I was in, like, elementary school. Like, I had ideas for games, which were well beyond my capacity to make. And, of course, before then, like, my ideas weren't even, like, fan game ideas. They were just, like, general ideas. I'm not sure if I'd want to, like, describe my, childish dreams at length, but...
I don't think anyone's going to worry too much about them. They're always, like, what you thought of at the time, regardless of how serious it is, if you have any in mind.
But, even then...
fair enough.
The younger you are, the harder it is to recall things with that sort of precision.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
The underlying idea is that, like, I had the desire for making games for a very long time. And it was in the fan game community, and particularly, like, being pointed to a tool and an engine to use, that desire, like, properly manifested.
So it was, like, because people could help you to start learning, they had guides and stuff available, that's what helped you to begin in the end?
More or less.
Okay.
I remember, actually, there was a post on the KN forum which outlined, like, the pros and cons of different fan game engines at the time. I believe the one who posted it was Chatran. I remember, like, it listed out a bunch of different old GameMaker 8 engines, such as Japan 2, V2 engine, Yo Sniper engine. What else was there? There was the Arunatian engine.
Oh, right, yeah.
Even, I want to say, there was a Necron engine, right?
Yeah. That was, like, one of the popular ones alongside U2. I mean, before U2, that was the main engine.
Yeah, so that was basically the bridge which allowed me to, like, properly get started. Although I want to say, funny little aside to that, this was the precise timing of this year, which I, like, discovered fan games and got started, was shortly after GameMaker Studio 1.4 had dropped. And so when I downloaded GameMaker, I downloaded the trial version of GameMaker Studio 1, and I tried to load the GameMaker 8 engines in that.
Yeah, I saw the story going this way.
Yeah, so I had to figure that out. But
yeah. I assume the engine tutorial didn't also say download GM8 to get these to work somewhere.
I forget precisely how I figured it out. It could have been I figured it out on my own, or I talked with someone and they just, like, gave me a straight up answer. Hard to remember.
Yeah.
One way or another.
So did you try out multiple engines, or did you just kind of, like, pick one and stick with it until you swapped over to Studio finally?
I tried out all the different engines. I remember Japan 2 engine was, like, I didn't like it because, like, I didn't like the sorts of objects that it had, and I didn't like the, like, sample assets that it provided. I think I tried out all of them. Irunitan was interesting, but obviously, like, it's a weird engine.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, I believe only Irunitan would get anything out of using their own engine. So in the end, I decided that U2 was the best engine for my intents and purposes because of the engine and, like, sample assets it provided.
And then, because obviously eventually you swapped over to Studio, did you try to, like, when you first swapped to Studio, why did you swap to Studio? And did you also try to port the engine you're used to using to Studio, or did you just swap engines as well?
I believe the reason I got started making games in Studio was because of a, like, general shift in fan games at the time. Before Yo-Yo-Yo Edition existed, like that particular GameMaker Studio engine, which was basically just like a porting of U2 engine with extra features and a better like code base. Before that point, there basically wasn't really any good engine for GameMaker Studio, but that was basically what opened the floodgates. And because of its similarities to U2 engine, I was allowed to basically like figure out in a trial by fire like what things were different about Studio between that and GameMaker 8.
Yeah, and the first time you tried to do a search function and accidentally create a new font again.
And also, basically realizing just how many crashes you have to deal with when you have uninitialized variables. Because GameMaker 8 just treats uninitialized variables as 0, and I was using that as like a function back in the day.
Yeah, there's definitely a fair few that have done that. Like, you always hear, air quote, proper coders that hear about the GM8 stuff and just kind of freak out a little bit over the fact that GameMaker kind of let you get away with code murder.
But yeah, I think the particular reason I switched to Studio engines was because I liked the new features that Studio promised. In particular, the shader support.
Interesting. So, did you have like something in mind when you started with shaders, with trying to learn it? I mean, or did you also kind of do it the same way you learned game making in the first place and just kind of searched what other people did and understood their code first, and then tried to incorporate it yourself?
It was basically like a lot of my early Studio projects were purely dedicated to trying to make visual effects. Not necessarily fan games proper, but just like singular shaders which could do cool things to the screen. I remember making a lot of shaders, and I remember as a reference, I tried to like recreate the sorts of like battle backgrounds that you would see in Earthbound and Mother 3.
Oh, interesting.
That was a particular like driving interest in me because I liked how those things looked and I wanted to recreate them. I wouldn't say that I did it very effectively.
So those haven't been used in future projects since then?
No. Even in general, honestly, like I would say it's pretty rare for me to actually deploy a shader in my games. Although I do sort of know how to do it nowadays. But there were lots of like quirks to shaders which I basically had no hope of figuring out back then. Such as the fact that the entire like texture atlas is a single page, and so when I would like wave the texture up and down, there would be like strange like deviations which I wasn't sure like why they were happening, and also like you would see when the scrolling background just like waves up in a particular direction, you'd just see like Hatsune Miku's sprite off to the side of it because that's where it was located on the texture page.
Sorry, I'm just picturing that, and that sounds so funny. That sounds like a prime material for a Sudoku game, just Miku popping out of the nowhere.
But yeah, I would say that like my understanding of shaders back then wasn't that great. It definitely took me quite a few years in the future to figure it out. And it was also like with the help of other fan gamers who actually had that experience that I figured it out, such as Zapmonk and Patrick, I believe, were the particular big names in that like 2016 to I want to say 18 to 19 era, where Studio was still sort of like on the rise. It was thanks to them that like people started to like figure out not only how to use Studio and like actually understanding how all the features worked, but also just like a general increase in quality all across the board in terms of like the sort of things that people made in fan games.
Okay, so to start a different kind of conversation but following on as well, it's like, so you've got all these people that are helping you to learn game making. However, at some point you still have to decide yourself what you want to make. And obviously we can see your catalogue now. I think it's pretty fair to say you have a pretty wide variety of games. It's not like a lot of people are like, I make avoidance games, or I like Needle. But if we look at what you've done, it's kind of hard to really like one-shot everything, because it's kind of whatever and anything you wanted to do. So when you start deciding to make a game, like, how exactly do you begin that?
I would say the answer sort of changes depending on the game. For my early games, like my really early games, they're basically just like, again, as I would describe it, a blank canvas. I did have several inspirations which I particularly pulled from, such as Nang, I've already iterated on. But also just like me, basically just doing whatever. And I would say that my fan games from earlier were a little bit more conventional, because the sorts of fan games that you would see at the time, a lot of them were really basic needle games. But as the years progressed and like more and more complicated fan games showed up, as well as like, I believe I had an interest in Camellia 3 at the time. Like, obviously that's sort of like the fan game, which
yeah, a lot of people had interest in Camellia 3.
Yeah, but even then, like, a particular reason why it had that draw was because of the production value that it had. And I remember a lot of my work at that time was because I wanted to make things in a similar level of like quality and presentation as Camellia 3. And that also included things like wanting to like figure out how to make a boss and stuff. I remember this is something that I'm basically the only one who would know about, but back in the day, before Discord, to just like set a general timeline, but after my earlier projects, I would sometimes do like Skype collabs with other people to make fan games. There was one fan game with someone who isn't in the community anymore, I don't want to say, and I couldn't remember their name if I tried. But I remember things like learning how to make a boss. I think I made a destination sort of fight many years back. But for an actual like proper example, which you can see today, I believe I have an old avoidance called Destroy the Easy. And
oh
just
my
from
god.
That word, yeah, you can like practically timestamp it just from that word alone. But the reason that game existed was because I believe CTWW basically came up to me as someone who makes fan games and had like this avoidance idea to go with this song. And I had the know-how and they had the ideas for the avoidance. And it was through putting two and two together that we basically like actually made an avoidance. So that was one way of
That
basically
is
creating a fan game.
certainly quite the collab, hearing CTWW's name involved with anything. Like, as far as I can tell, that's the only game CT has on Delph still, funnily enough, so congratulations on being a very unique position there.
Yeah, but obviously, to continue talking about like my reasons for making fan games and the like particular variety that I have, to fast forward to basically the start of the Discord era onwards, people were starting to like all across the community like not only understand GameMaker, but also make like more and more creative games with better visuals and more interesting gimmicks and stuff like that. And additionally, like beyond just fan games, there were also plenty of like real games that inspired me and I could use as inspiration. And so I believe a lot of my fan games from that point onwards, while the inspirations that I draw from would be pretty different in a lot of cases, the underlying idea was that I wanted to emulate the sort of things which I found entertaining at the time. And a lot of things can entertain you from a lot of different genres. So I believe that's sort of why a lot of the fan games which I've made have such a variety, is just because like I can be pulled in any one of several directions with like a passing fascination. And if I want to make something which is similar to those, then that would lead to an inherent variety in the sorts of things I make.
So, like, there's real games and fan games that inspired you. Do you have any examples of either of them? And, like, how did they inspire you exactly, if you can remember?
Let's see. So, actually, let me pull up Delfruit. Let me just take a minute here.
Yeah, that's fine. Because, yeah, you mentioned K3 obviously is a big deal for visuals. Nang, I assume... I mean, a lot of people were pretty inspired by Nang because it was such a big deal at the time. But, like, both, like, visually and gameplay-wise, I assume both of those kind of affected you in some way. But, obviously, outside of that, like, Eric is a big fan of Sublime, which I can understand looking at the game. I'm not sure if that affected you in quite the same way.
Okay, looking through my page right now, I've already got some interesting examples lined up. So, let's see. I think a good place to start, funnily enough, is an old fan game. I'm not sure most people would even remember that I made this game, but it's called I Want to Introspect. And the idea of the game is that it's basically like a pretty straightforward needle game, but the main gimmick is that whenever the kid is moving, they're invisible.
Interesting, okay.
And I remember the reason which I came up with that game was because I was playing Celeste at the time. And in that game, there's this variant option which basically turns Madeline invisible, but I believe there's still a trail effect, like a blue and a red, whenever Madeline dashes. And I remember being fascinated by the idea of that variant, and so I turned it into a fan game, where whenever the kid would like move and jump around, an after image would sort of appear, but the kid themselves would be invisible. And that was basically like one example of me turning something which fascinated me into a fan game.
Interesting. And you said there were also fan games that inspired you too. Was there something like that was already a fan game that you turned into another fan game?
Let's see. I think a good example for that would be, let's see, looking through my Delphi page. Probably, this is going to be sort of another curveball, but I Want a Cute Jump is a good example. And what that game is, to basically like TLDR it, is I remember playing a game a year or so prior called just Cute Jump. It was made by Sylvie, and that game wasn't actually a fan game of I Want to Be the Guy, but rather a fan game of Jumper, which is by Maddie Thorson. And that game had a lot of like weird, bizarre mechanics in it, such as like blocks which had a timer on them, which they would like expire after the time went out, as well as luck blocks, which if you like touch them, then there's only like a certain percentage chance that they would be solid. Things like that. Lots of strange ideas were actually things I borrowed from Sylvie's games. Sylvie's not a particularly notable like fan game creator, but she has a large variety of very interesting games, which also served as inspirations for me. And I remember, because of I Want a Cute Jump, and actually just Cute Jump in general, I believe that sort of inspired me to make, well, not only just I Want a Cute Jump, but also some parts of designer L's Wacky Rant Venture.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, so Cute Jump directly led to the Wacky Rant Venture.
I wouldn't say it's a like full inspiration, but definitely a partial inspiration. Just the idea of like luck being a game mechanic. I know that existed in other fan games prior to like my discovery of Cute Jump. I remember there's a really old fan game. I forget the title, but it had like 3 different modes, where I believe like there was like a random chance for a save point to be real or stuff like that. I don't remember the name, unfortunately, but I know that the idea existed and that I was aware of it when I went into the project.
Yeah, I think I remember the game you're talking about as well, but I couldn't remember the name for the life of me. So, So, yeah, it's like, it helped you take an idea even further what you originally had an idea for. So, is this something that's happened much for you then? It's like, have you ever, like, you finished a game and then there's something that makes you think, but what if I go further with this?
Yeah, I believe a very potent version of that would be, again, let's see, I'm blanking on the name right now. Hold on, let me collect myself. Jqck, that's the one. Obviously, I've got a pretty notable release attached to that. Figure out the name yourself, but other than that, Jqck was also, like, in between Jqck and that, there was also me wanting to use the idea of Jqck and Ranventure. So that's another case of an inspiration, which was sort of partial, but because I had knowledge of it, and because I could sort of combine it with the idea of luck, that's why there's a screen in Ranventure which involves, like, random keys.
Interesting. Sorry, if that what I was trying to say was, like, have you ever, like, finished a game and then when you've gotten to the end of the game you thought, okay, this game is done, but what if I keep going with it? Was the idea that I was trying to say there. Sorry, I guess I wasn't very clear.
I would say that it's not necessarily the act of finishing a game which causes me to be inspired by it. Like, even if it's just me watching the game or becoming aware of it, I would say that's when it crosses the threshold of becoming able to inspire me. And whenever I'm iterating on the sorts of ideas which I see there, it's not necessarily because I, like, finished them and they're, like, fresh on my mind and I want to make something with them. It's enough that they're just sort of, like, dormant in my memory. And whenever I have an idea, which I want to say is a pretty random process, like, you can't sort of control the thoughts you have. It's just whatever you have at the time when you're thinking of ideas. You'll inevitably connect some dots and throw out others. And through that random process is how these sorts of old inspirations will manifest in the projects which I'm working on.
Yeah, okay, alright, that's cool. So, as like a bit of an aside thing, like, you've had ideas that have, like, helped you make games over time. However, I mean, I think it's obvious, it's understandable that it would have to come up at some point. What made Lockpick become so much of a bigger game than the rest then? Do you just, like, you came up with an idea for it originally thanks to Jqck, and then you started making things, and then for some reason it just never ended? Or did you, like, you started the project and you already had everything in mind that you wanted to do there?
Okay, so this is an interesting one. So Lockpick's story, this was after Ranventure, so I already had some experience with making, like, Lockpick as, like, an engine. And I definitely remember, like, thinking, I think it was around the time I was thinking of making a sequel to Ranventure, which would have an even more complicated Lockpick screen, which was, like, randomly generated and even had, like, random assets. And it was thanks to that I was thinking, well, what would it be like to generalize the idea of Jqck and generalize its mechanics into a game? And I believe that was the starting point for Lockpick as a project. And when I started work on that, I was thinking, like, what are the mechanics of Jqck? And what sort of gaps exist in the mechanics of Jqck? Because, like, it does have a lot of mechanics already, but there were ways in which it had stuff that there were sort of, like, gaps in the mechanics it had. Like, for example, Jqck, it has brown doors in it, right? Which, whenever they appear in Jqck, they're just something that you use a master key on to destroy, and that's just, like, a part of how they work. As well as, like, black keys and stuff, which hardly ever appeared. So lots of things which Jqck basically, like, teased, but then, like, never properly delivered on. And so when I reviewed those sorts of gaps in what it showed off, I came to my own answers about what sort of mechanics could arise from properly like answering those questions. And in the process, I got more and more ideas, like just filling out a bucket list of a whole bunch of ideas. And it was a list that just like, it kept on growing more and more over time. I remember the scope of Lockpick was supposed to be like quite a bit smaller than it is now as a finished product. Obviously, I released that demo version, which was like the first like proper form of Lockpick, which just had like the amount of worlds and gimmicks it had, and then it just sort of cut off.
Yeah, like the first half of the game, sort of, right?
Yeah, and so when I was making the demo, for the most part, I had the gimmicks all planned out from the start. I did do a little bit of rearranging and even inventing a few new mechanics partway in the process. But for the most part, I did have an idea back then of how big the game would be. But it was when I was trying to make the last area of the game, which involves some much more complicated like meta mechanics, that the scope of the game basically ballooned. Because what happened was I had an idea which was so ripe with potential that the ways in which I could explore it were like extremely massive and beyond my comprehension. And it was thanks to that I had to basically like section off the game into two distinct parts and basically like separate it, the first half into the demo and everything else into the full game.
Interesting. So the final screen of part 1 is like this huge huge screen which uses kind of every key type and forces you to go back and forth a lot. So you're saying that like that wasn't really planned to be in the game at all originally?
The large screens were for the most part planned, I think. It was the final world, which was basically like you can basically imagine it as a microcosm of everything that part 2 would involve. It was in the process of figuring out what that world would be that the scope got out of hand, and I had to like properly like invent a whole new half of the game.
Interesting. And then was all the extra stuff, because obviously not everyone's too aware of like just how deep the rabbit hole goes, so I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail there. But like, if you try to truly do everything in the game, was all of that also planned from the get-go, or did that also come along as you realized just how much things could expand?
For the most part, I would say that it was all planned out. But of course, there was sort of like an intermediate phase where I was still like figuring out everything that should exist. But once I hit a point where I was like reasonably out of ideas, that was when I basically had the scope fully outlined. In fact, if you look at the dev logs for Lockpick on the itch.io page, there should be one in which I lay out a map structure for the full game of Lockpick.
Oh, interesting.
Which it dates back to like, I want to say over a year before the full version released. But even then, its resemblance to like the final form of Lockpick is extremely similar. Like there's only a very few slight changes, and those weren't even like things being added, but in fact rather like removed. Just as I like realized which ideas were a little bit too much work to add. So in the end, I actually took more things out of Lockpick than I initially envisioned for it.
So, like, would you say there's whole worlds that have been removed by the end of things, or what? Like, how much cut content is there? Because every project always has cut content.
I have basically, like, an entire list of not only, like, puzzles, but also, like, I want to say well over a dozen mechanics which didn't appear in the final game.
Oh, dang, okay.
Like, there was basically going to be, like, to not get into too much spoilers, there was going to be basically an extension of every world in the game, which would introduce an extra new mechanic, and basically, like, double the size of the game.
Oh,
But
Jesus, that sounds like so much. The game's already huge.
yeah, and at the time I was fascinated by the prospect of it because obviously like I had a lot of cool ideas, but at some point I realized like double the content means like double the work. And also, even though I did have a lot of ideas, it was becoming harder and harder to like properly like fit them in a way that was satisfying. And so at some point I just decided to like cut my losses early and basically scrap a gigantic portion of the game. And there are still remnants of it and like what it would have been, but for the most part, like it was definitely a notable example of me like cutting down on the scope of the game. But I think that was the biggest thing I removed. There were definitely some other like puzzles, and like little tiny sections of content which were originally planned but removed. But for the most part, other than that, I did have everything for Lockpick planned out from the start.
So, is there any chance... So if you know, like, Patrick's Power Box, for example, at the end of the game, after you've beaten things, he has, like, a little gimmick room where he kind of inverses some mechanics. So, is there any chance that we get, like, Lockpick the Lost levels with the 1 or 2 screens of the ideas that you had at some point in the future?
I'd say unlikely, but I do have a sort of gallery in the final version of Lockpick, which basically explains what all of the unused mechanics would have been.
Oh, I'm sorry, is Lockpick not done yet then?
No, it is done.
Okay.
However, I did include as basically a little like post-game bonus, literally like a museum of sorts, where all of the unused mechanics are basically like introduced and described in detail of what they would have been.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Yeah, it's always interesting to see the sort of stuff that, like, people had to decide to get rid of just because otherwise things were taking long enough as they were. That's actually genuinely really interesting. I'm kind of surprised I wasn't aware of that. I'll try to find out some more about that one then. Yeah, I guess we're coming to the end of the list of questions that I've got here, though. So, as a bit, like, a complete aside, for people that are starting off nowadays, because obviously there's a lot more information out there, that it's a lot easier to get started with things, would you have any advice for people that are, like, starting out, for, like, things they could look out for, or good ways to learn?
I would say the first start point is to find out what interests you, and if there are any resources on how the things that interest you are made, then you should study them. And like study them in any amount of detail that's necessary for you to like approach that level of comprehension that'll allow you to make them. And another piece of advice is definitely make a habit of asking other people with more experience than you questions about like how to get started, what resources they have in mind that you might be unaware of. And sometimes they'll even graciously just help you out with making the project directly. But definitely ask people for help, because you'll learn things that way, which you might not have found out just through your own.
Do you have anywhere specifically in mind? Because obviously finding places to ask people can be a bit difficult sometimes as well. Unless you mean like somebody in, like, a group of people in particular that you can ask that are available for this sort of thing.
I'd say it's a hard question to answer in general. Obviously, we're mostly speaking in the context of fan games here.
Yeah.
So a good example in that particular context would be basically like the general hub, which everyone knows about, is the I Want a Community server on Discord, and there are dedicated channels in that for discussing GameMaker and how to make fan games. And if you ask a question there, you will get an answer. There are some very experienced game makers, such as Renex, is the primary source of knowledge, which currently most people can consult. And if you want some piece of knowledge about what to do to make something in a game, they're a good person to get an answer from. But just in general, like to find that sort of person to help you in your endeavors, I'd say it's just like a matter of keeping an open eye and branching out, and you'll definitely have to put in some work to search, but eventually you should find something.
Alright, thanks for the answer. And then, before we do finish then, there's one final question, which you can answer this in as much or as little detail as you like. Are there any projects that you're currently working on at the moment that you'd like to talk about?
So most of the projects which I'm working on, as of right now, aren't actually fan games. I do have some old ideas for fan games and some old projects still on the back burner, but nowadays I've been basically learning how to the puppy's making some noise behind. I've been okay. This is going to get a little bit ridiculous. Hold on a minute.
Yeah, that's fine. If I had an advert, I could sell out here. However, welcome to Fangame Marathon. We'll probably be doing I Want to Be the Guy fan games, Toho fan games, Super Mario 64 fan games. June, July-ish. And people speedrun them and it's cool. There's going to be dead air until Watson gets back, so, you know.
Alright, I've gone and chased him off, so... let's see. So to answer your question about the sort of games that I'm working on at the moment, I do have ideas for, I want to say 3 projects are my primary projects at this moment. 2 of them are puzzle games. One of them is a game that's sort of similar to a game called Void Stranger.
A little-known game.
Not
hugely popular.
Yeah, another game that's a puzzle game is it's a pretty basic sort of like math-oriented puzzle game. It's sort of like, I want to say it's similar to Lockpick, but it's far more like simple, but also like a particular spice that I've been trying to like add to it is creating basically a custom programming language in the game itself. To use for both like the levels and for the player to use to like solve the levels.
Is this still in GameMaker, or are you learning another language for this?
It's in GameMaker, and I'm creating a language in GameMaker.
Okay, just double checking how it's working. Cool.
They would probably be way too long to explain the details, but if you want even just like a vague idea of what it's like, then you can open up Jqck, and you'll see that game has its own sort of programming language implementation. It's not a particularly used aspect of Jqck, but it does exist. And while it's not the same as what I'm making, it'll probably at least give you some pointers. But it's an extremely complicated thing. Like I had to talk to a friend with a degree in computer science to like figure out some of what it's like to make a programming language in GameMaker.
And that's going to be a puzzle game that people can play eventually.
Yes.
That sounds like it's going to be on the harder end, which does not surprise me.
Yeah. Nothing coming soon, so I won't even like say the names of the projects, but that's the 2 puzzle games which I'm working on. And then the last game, which is, I want to say it's sort of like the coalescence of like so many of my interests, is a bullet hell game.
Oh, that is a different one. Yet again, spreading out to something else.
Yeah. It's sort of hard to describe in simple terms, but it's basically a game which is important enough to me that I learned a lot of different parts of game making, like a lot of different branches of things that of different skills to pick up for the sake of game making, such as art. Like I wasn't that good at art back in the day. Like the best I could do was just some like silly comics in MS Paint. But as of a few years back, I want to say around 2021 to 22, was when I started seriously picking up art for the sake of working on a game. And I've also like learned how to make music. I've got FL Studio as well as PX Tone, which is a good free option for like very simple sort of chiptune music. Although it's not really chiptune, it's more just like samples and stuff. But art, music, game design, like all sorts of different skills, which have taken me years to learn. But like I've been putting in that effort because I want to eventually make this bullet hell game of mine a reality someday. Like it's complicated and large enough in scope that there is a chance that I'll actually like never make it. But just in case, like I do think it's a project which is very important to me. So hopefully I can show it off someday. I definitely show off small parts of it. I know on my socials sometimes I'll share a little bit of art, which I basically made for the service of that giant project of mine. And again, I haven't talked about names. I wouldn't say it's too important at this moment because I haven't made a substantial amount of progress in any of the games, but maybe one day I'll talk about them in a bit more detail. But that's where I'm at the moment.
Yeah, so are all three of these solo projects, or is there somebody else helping out a little bit with any of them?
That a computer science friend has given me pointers. They're not necessarily a collaborator, but at the very least, I'll say that there are people who help me with my projects, even if there aren't necessarily people who work with me on the project.
Gotcha, yeah, just people you ask questions to every so often, rather than people that are directly involved.
But yeah, as of right now, I'm still a solo act.
Yeah, makes sense. I do find it interesting you say you were learning art for this, because I feel like most people would say that your art design, at least in your games, was pretty good for like a good while, even before Lockpick came around.
I'd say that there's sort of a distinction to be drawn between the sorts of art that is in my old fan games and the sort of art that I do nowadays. Because in my old fan games, they're basically just like, it's just like small sprite work. And even then, it's sort of more abstract stuff, like just cool blocks and graphical effects more than anything. Like, I know I'm particularly notable for the use of drop shadows in my game.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Like, I've sort of got a language of different effects, which are practically like identifiers that I worked on a particular game. But I wouldn't say that they're the same as art, but they're just like notable motifs across my games, which happen to take on a visual form. But when I'm referring to learning art, I mean like actually like drawing and stuff. And
Gotcha.
even like doing things like character designs and stuff.
Yeah, you have shown some of that off in Lockpick.
Yeah, not just Lockpick, but also like again on my social media, I'll post like actual art from my projects. And even in my icons for my profile pictures and social media and stuff, that's all drawn by me.
Interesting, okay. And I'm seeing that, like, I don't know much about the art that you've got on there. Is that stuff that's planned to be used for games in the future, or is that just stuff you felt like drawing on the moment?
It's all sorts of art can like serve different purposes. They don't necessarily have to be used for projects. Sometimes they only like serve the role of like being used for like a simple thing like a profile picture and stuff like that. But lots of different reasons to draw.
Cool. Well, that definitely sounds like you got a lot going on then. And then There's nothing even remotely close to finished at the moment, though, right? It's all just like all early days.
I'd say don't expect anything substantial from me for most of my projects within the year.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. As a bit of an aside, so how do you decide which one you want to work on at the time, or is it just whatever you're feeling like in the moment?
Back then, particularly when Lockpick was still under development, I used to agonize about like which one of my many projects I should be giving attention to. And nowadays, I've settled on the mindset of whatever I'm thinking about at the moment, and whatever like my heart calls out to me to work on, is what I'm gonna work on. Because like Lockpick was in a unique circumstance where, because of the demo version and the promise that it would eventually be finished, there was sort of like an obligation almost for me to finish it, which was not necessarily the best sort of feeling to have while working on a game. Because even though Lockpick does have a lot of stuff that was a great source of enjoyment for me to create, there were also some parts which were decidedly a headache, such as the options menu in particular.
Yeah, I think a fair number of developers complain about when it comes to menuing.
But yeah, but nowadays I don't have any particular obligation to finish my projects, which gives me a lot more leeway to just like follow my heart. And even if I work on a project and put it on the back burner, I don't even necessarily have to promise to come back around to it eventually. It's just like one day perhaps I'll feel in the mood again, and then that's when I'll decide to work on it. That's the current mindset that I have.
That sounds like a very nice free-form way of looking at things then. Yeah,
maybe it'd be different if I had a job, but...
So, yeah, game making isn't your full-time job then, is that what you're saying? Lockpick hasn't earned you all the money with how big a project it was?
Lockpick hasn't earned me any.
Ah, shucks, dang, that's crazy. Can't believe a free game didn't earn anything.
But yeah, even still, there's a chance that my future games will also be free. Like, even if they weren't burdened by things such as like copyright and stuff like that. Like, it's just a choice of mine that I want to keep my games free so that people can play them.
Yeah, that's reasonable. I can get that. Yeah, they like to have like more people just be able to play a game sometimes instead of earning things off it as well.
It's a complicated set of principles to go into at the moment, but yeah.
Well, that's cool. Yeah, no, that was really good information. That was really interesting to hear everything, honestly. Like, thank you very much for your time, then. I hope there's been some interesting questions in here for you as well that you found fun to answer.
Yeah, I would say it's been pretty nice to ruminate about all of this.
Cool, and yeah, well then, yeah, thank you very much for chatting. For people watching, I hope you enjoyed. Please feel free to enjoy the rest of the awards, and maybe there'll be more interviews next year for you to listen to. Anything you want to sign off with?
Follow your dreams, fellows. Yep.
Follow your dreams, people.
That's my thingamabob. The thing has been the bob. Alright, see you later.
See you next time.